Bundesliga Matchday 23 is been and gone, and obviously the biggest thing from this week has been the death of the title race. The title race that was already hanging by a thread. So obviously it's time to look back at that and everything else that happened this weekend. So quickly on Friday, there was a big game roughly in the context of the bottom of the table with Mainz versus Hamburg. This finished 1-1. It was a big point for Hamburg because they've opened up the gap because of what happened elsewhere. They've opened up the gap at the bottom of the table. So they now have a decent buffer. Same can kind of be said for Mainz, but they probably wish they came away with more. It was a bit of a feisty game. Considering the amount of yellow cards in the game. But overall, the standout player was Nadim Amiri. So since Urs Fischer took charge, Amiri missed the Bayern game, his first in charge, and he came back against St. Pauli. But since then, he scored 7 goals in 7 games. He scored in more or less every single game that he's played under Urs Fischer. And so basically he's refound his form, and what made Amiri such an asset to Mainz when they escaped relegation in his half season at the club last season as well as now, he's shown that form again. And obviously what's been seen is when Amiri plays well, Mainz play well. So the first big game of this weekend was between Bayern Munich and Eintracht Frankfurt. Obviously this was a Frankfurt side that had new head coach in Albert Riera, while Bayern were Bayern, and this is the start of a run which could potentially shake up the title race. And if Bayern failed to win, it would have created a bit of a problem heading into next weekend. But obviously in terms of the build-up of the game, nothing to do with the game itself. So 2 very contrasting press conferences. Bayern's Vincent Kompany gave a very good and strong statement about the racist abuse towards Vinicius Jr. from Benfica, while in Frankfurt, Bild had asked Albert Riera a question based on Max Kruse and Martin Harnik saying that they want him to fail because he's quite a confident individual and stuff, especially considering Max Kruse was a bit of a bastard when he was a player. And he's a bit of a bastard of a person as well. So it's quite ironic. And then in the press conference, Riera replies, who? If you're not a Bundesliga sicko, I doubt you know who Max Kruse is. And so after he goes, later on the day, Frankfurt then post on social media a reply to criticising Bild for asking this question and basically saying how someone with a picture of the penis on the internet should not have their opinion taken seriously. And that was aimed at Max Kruse. And so Frankfurt replied to this, or Bild replied to this with an article basically saying that journalists will never stop, whatever. Who gives a fuck, is Bild. But the headline of the article was Eintracht attackiert penis video. So the build-up of the game had nothing to do with the football or what could potentially happen. It was about Frankfurt fighting Bild over a person who's got his knob on the internet. And I just think the phrase, obviously German has a lot of complex words, but then there's also phrases that you could just tell what they mean in English, and that's one of them. In terms of what happened on the pitch, Bayern really stormed into the lead. Alexander Pavlovic opened the scoring with a long-range effort, which Kawa Santos really should have done better to save, but he didn't. And then Kane scored to make it 2-0, and then just after half-time, Kane scored again, and you're thinking, well, this is how it's going to go now. But what showed that this is slightly different to how Bayern were in other big games this season, where they would just kill their opponent more or less, is they allowed Frankfurt to get back into the game. Ironically, Harry Kane gives away a penalty, which Jonathan Burkhardt, who is on his return, scores, and then Arno Calamuendo scores in the 86th minute, but it was a bit too little too late. So it does show that, Frankfurt were kind of outdone by injuries. I mean, the fact that Jonathan Burkhardt made his return helps, but also shows that how they're not at their full strength. And you could see that even in their starting lineup as well. I mean, Callum Wender and Burkhardt were both subbed on in the 60th minute. I mean, they were playing Elias Skiri as a centre-back, which, you're in the trenches when you're doing that. I mean, Robin Cox injured, Arthur Theat, Rasmus Christensen, Can Huzin, Ansgar Knauf, Ebni Talib as well. They're all injured. And so this was a bit of like a makeshift Frankfurt team. So the fact they were able to come back from 3-0 down to make it 3-2 is a positive. Obviously, again, as I mentioned, there are now question marks about Arne Cara Santos. Because he should have done better with the Pavlovic goal, for example. But what this did mean is Bayern temporarily opened the gap on Borussia Dortmund in second to 9 points. And so it really put the pressure on Dortmund in the case of if they don't win here, then the title race is more or less over. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to fuck the chronological order straight to Leipzig-Dortmund. And the title race is now more or less over because this was a must-win game for Dortmund, and even after what Bayern did, and they didn't win. They drew 2-2, and in fact they were genuinely horrible in the first half as well. Jan Diomande and Brian Gruder had a field day. Christoph Baumgartner is continuing to have a very good season as well. I think he's on 10 goals now. So basically, Diomande and Gruder just tore apart Julian Ryerson and Daniel Svensson. Obviously, again, Dortmund, a bit like Frankfurt, a bit like patched up, especially in defence. I mean, you're in a really important game. You're playing an 18-year-old centre-back in Luca Reggiana, and then you're playing Rami Benzabaini too. So they were generally horrible in the first half, but they managed to improve their performances in the second. And as they chased the winner, it became a bit of a basketball game, and Diomande had an even better chance to make it. I think it would have been 3-1 or 3-0 at that point. And what it came of light during this game is the fact that Dortmund's depth is horrible. Like, you look who they can bring on the bench. They brought on Connie Chukwuemeka, Jan Koto, Fabio Silva, Karim Adeyemi, and Julian Brandt. If we're being completely honest, none of these players are really like game changers or players that you could trust to, especially in a game where you're literally fighting for the title. They're not really the type of people you could rely on to make that difference. And granted, it did make a difference as Fabio Silva scored a late goal. But in the grand scheme of things, this meant nothing. That late goal, as much as Dortmund celebrated like they'd overtaken Bayern with that extra point, it cut the gap from 9 points to 8 points. And so it meant fuck all. Now with the gap at 8 points, this was a must-win game. Like it would, if Bayern had lost, then this is even more must-win. But the fact that Bayern had won, this was also must-win for very different reasons. But the fact that Dortmund didn't win means that they now have to beat Bayern next week to then hope to bring the gap down to 5 points, and then you have to hope that Bayern drop points at least. If they draw, at least 3 times. If they win, if they lose, then two times they have to drop points, or lose, should I say. And considering how Bayern have been playing, granted they haven't been the best in recent games, but considering how they've been playing, you find that very hard to believe that Bayern could do that. And with the way Dortmund have been playing, you also find it hard to believe that if Bayern do drop points, Dortmund will be able to take advantage of that. Because it's quite obvious that the way Dortmund have been playing is unsustainable and they're significantly overperforming. And so I think it's only a matter of time when reality and fatigue will hit. I mean, the positive for Dortmund is they're more likely not last long in the Champions League when it's expected that they qualify against Atalanta. And they're going to play either Arsenal or Bayern. You're more than likely not going to make it that far. But Dortmund needed to win this game, and then they had to go to Bayern next week and beat them, and then the pressure's on. But the fact that it didn't means, yeah, you can go and beat Bayern next week, but in the grand scheme of things, is it going to make that much of a difference? Back to the afternoon games, Leverkusen lost 1-0 to Union. They now lost touch to the top 4 or the Champions League places, and they were genuinely crap. They had one shot on target as well. Granted, they had a bit of a tough game in midweek against Olympiacos, and Olympiacos had beat them earlier in the league phase. But you beat Olympiacos, and then you've got this game, so back-to-back away games is not ideal. But you lose with a pretty tragic performance. And then next week, this week, you then have to play Olympiacos again. Now, 2-0 is a relatively comfortable lead, but if you believe in cliches, it's also quite an uncomfortable lead as well. And so if Leverkusen produce a performance like they did against Union, then and Olympiacos play the way they did when they played each other, this could become a bit of a problem if Leverkusen aren't switched on. Granted, this was a semi-changed side from in midweek. I mean, Vasquez, Poku, Schick all played and came off the bench. Kwanzaa and Palacios didn't play at all. So yeah, but as I've said before, Union's not an easy place to go. But only producing one shot out of 16 on target, that is a problem. Then at the bottom, Augsburg played Wolfsburg. Obviously, Augsburg have now a bit of a decent buffer to the relegations because of their series of wins, while Wolfsburg are truly in the trenches. They took the lead twice, but threw it away, and 2 late goals from Augsburg, from Gregoritsch and I think Elias Rexaby, meant Wolfsburg are now, well, they already were, but they're now well and truly in the title, in the relegation fight now. I mean, they're level on points with 17th or 16th place St. Pauli, and you can't really see where things are going to improve. I mean, Daniel Bauer has not improved them at all. Since returning from AFCON, Mohamed Amour has been wasteful. Desnan Puzinovic, he arrived and then he's disappeared again because he just sits on the bench. When considering the situation that Wolfsburg find themselves in, maybe, I don't know, it's time that you play Amour alongside Puzinovic, at least give that a go. I mean, there's a way to fit them in together, but you find a way for them to play together, and that could potentially help. So yeah, Wolfsburg, generally, if they got relegated, this may be one of the great things that happened to the Bundesliga, because the fact that the team that spends and splashes the cash so much and is so crap have struggled, which we need. Then the other Saturday game saw Cologne face Hoffenheim. It finished 2-2, but the most notable thing here was Ragnar Acher's goal. It was a bicycle kick and a potential goal of the season contender. I mean, we've already had great goals this season. Luis Diaz against Union, Luka Vuskovic against Werder Bremen. And now I'm a bit of a critique of overhead kicks. I think it has to be a truly good overhead kick. I mean, ones where you quite low to the ground and it bounces or hits the bottom corner or whatever, I don't rate those. I don't see them as equal to the likes of Acher's goal, where he gets the height, he hits it, the ball doesn't lose verticality, it goes straight into the top corner. That's one of the better overhead kicks that have existed. And obviously though, Diaz's goal against Union won ARD Goal of the Year for 2025. So it will be tough competition for Acher when it comes to potentially winning goal of the season. Then on Sunday, Freiburg beat Borussia Mönchengladbach 2-1. They closed the gap on Europe. Gladbach are very much in a similar position to Wolfsburg, where things are just not improving at all, and they're just going backwards. They play a horrible football, and their horrible football has meant they've now been sucked well and truly back into the relegation battle. They're now only 2 points clear of 16th, granted so are Mainz, but with the way they've been playing, it's really not looking good for Gladbach. There's a real possibility that they could actually be relegated. With how the relegated teams are performing, and they're actually showing fight, St. Pauli, Heidenheim, we could see there's probably a world where we see a bottom 3 of Werder Bremen, Wolfsburg and Borussia Mönchengladbach. 2 traditional clubs and 3 former winners of the Bundesliga, which would be a problem, a big problem. But as we've said, and has been pointed out many times before, this has basically been coming for Gladbach. Each time they've flirted with relegation but managed to see themselves out away from it. This season, I think it doesn't have that same feeling. It feels like they could really be in trouble, especially even when we head into the final game of the season. Speaking of the bottom, while we have big games at the top, the biggest game at the bottom was between 16th and 17th, Werder Bremen versus St. Pauli. And St. Pauli won. A big important 3 points for them. They do rise up to 16th, while Werder Bremen dropped down into the relegation zone now. Bremen probably wish they did better. Mia Backhaus did make a mistake for the first goal. It kind of slipped through his fingers, and he really should have done better for that. But with the way Bremen have been performing, you kind of expect a win should be on the horizon soon, and Daniel Thion's first win as head coach. And that kind of has to happen now. Now or never, really, because they play Heidenheim, Union, Mainz, Wolfsburg in the next 4 games. 3 of those fellow teams in the bottom half. So they really should win. And if they don't, then it makes you really think, why did they get rid of Horst Steffen? You know, that could be a massive mistake, which has actually cost them their Bundesliga status, especially considering how consistent of a team they were under Ole Werner. But obviously St. Pauli, you know, they have been in the trenches, and it really looked like they were struggling. But they've managed to escape partially and get out of it, or look like they could get out of it. They're not out of the woods yet. But with how the teams above them are playing, they could probably be out of there pretty quickly. And then the final game was a big, what the hell moment. It was Heidenheim versus Stuttgart, who finished 3-3. Stuttgart will obviously be the most annoyed with this result. They led twice, but needed a late goal to come to rescue the point. So they scored early on from Chris Furic. Aaron Dinchey equalised. Then Arjon Ibrahimovic made it 2-1 for Heidenheim. Mittelstadt then scored just after half-time. Then Cyril Conte looked like he may have won it with an 82nd minute goal, but then Dennis Undav scored in the 88th minute. Obviously, there was a lot of question marks about this game because Ermedin Demirovic did have 2 goals disallowed. But it doesn't, for the grand scheme of things for Stuttgart, they still retained their position in the top 4, especially because Leipzig drew. But Heidenheim, they're actually now 4 points from safety. And as I said, they're putting up a bit more of a fight than the likes of Wolfsburg and Gladbach. So, as I've said plenty of times before, the relegation fight is generally going to be a slog for more or less every team that's in it. God knows who's actually going to go down in 2 months' time. And I think there's going to be lots of twists and turns still yet to come. And obviously, speaking of the table, as I said, Bayern are now 8 points clear of Dortmund. Heidenheim are still 3rd. They're 3 points ahead of Stuttgart, but 6 points behind Dortmund. Leipzig are 5th, 2 points behind Stuttgart, while Leverkusen are 6th. And obviously at the bottom, I don't know why I said 4, it's 6 points. Heidenheim are 18th on 14, Werder Bremen are 17th on 19, and St. Pauli are 16th on 20. But Wolfsburg are just above them on 20, Gladbach and Mainz then make up the 2 teams above them and are also on 22. Obviously next week the big game is obviously Dortmund versus Bayern. As I said, it's a must win for Dortmund. If they don't win, then the title race is over. I mean, we're already on the verge of it's over. But if Dortmund win this, then we're on the slight brink of we're so back. But again, it's so slim. I mean, if you put this percentage wise, it was probably 15% before the weekend, and now it's dropped down to 5. But yeah, so Dortmund really need a win if they want to look like a competent team and actually show maybe the title race does exist. They need to win. If they don't, then we can say the title is over now and we can focus elsewhere. Another big game at the bottom is Bremen versus Heidenheim. Then you have Leverkusen versus Mainz, Stuttgart versus Wolfsburg, Frankfurt versus Freiburg, which is big in terms of the context of chasing Europe. And yeah, Hamburg then round out the match day against Leipzig. So let me know what you think about the match day. Is the title race still on? I obviously don't think it is. Are Dortmund a competent team, and who you think could potentially be relegated?